If you're watching this video on the day that it's released, you'll also know that the ZMF Atrium that I've got here has just been released for sale today. These were announced on the 18th of March, but they're only actually arriving in people's hands and able to be ordered as opposed to pre-ordered as of today, the 1st of April. So with a huge thanks to Zach and Bevan over at ZMF or ZMF Headphones, let's jump in and find out all there is to know about the ZMF Atrium. The Atrium is a $2,500 open back headphone from ZMF or ZMF. I'm going to keep saying ZMF because I'm Australian, and rather than replacing the ZMF Verite, which is the other flagship $2,500 headphone from ZMF Headphones, the Atrium's actually going to sit alongside it. And so I've got lots to cover in this review for you. I'm going to talk about the Atrium obviously for its own merits, what it's like in isolation if that's the only headphone you want, but also how it compares to the existing Verite, and whether or not I think it's a headphone where people might want to own both, whether Verite owners might want to trade across to an Atrium, whether they might want to own both. I'll cover all of that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some pad rolling, not in huge depth, but I will cover it. And so by the time I cover all of that ground, this might be a long review. So do use the chapter markers if you just want specific information about specific topics. Check out the chapter markers in the description or along the timeline, and jump to the parts you're after. Also, if you're all about ZMF headphones and you want more, do keep in mind that I've got the Verite Open and Closed coming up soon. I'm basically going to do a comparison between the two, whilst also obviously talking about each one individually, and I'm planning to also do a bit of a deep dive into pad rolling on ZMF headphones, using the Atrium, the Verite, and the Verite Closed. So if all of that sounds interesting to you, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and now let's get into talking about the brand new ZMF Atrium. The version that I've got here in front of me is in the cherry wood finish. So it's got the cherry wood cups, and then it's got the black grills and the black rods up here. At release, this is also being made with an aged cherry look, which is kind of a bit darker, and the aged cherry has an aged copper grill and rod. And then finally there's a limited edition Babinga version, which is going to have a stainless steel grill and stainless steel rods. But as I understand it, this cherry and black is kind of the stock version of what to expect for the Atrium, but as always with ZMF headphones, you can expect different wood types and different grill colours over time. That's part of what makes the ZMF headphones so special, is that they're handcrafted works of art. I'm going to get to the design details of the Atrium, what makes it special, the brand new technology that Zach has designed that goes into this. But before I get to that, I just want to mention some of the basic details that it's worth knowing if you buy yourself a set of Atriums. What you're going to get in the shipping box is a Pelican style case, so a very large sealed hard case with a foam interior, housing your new ZMF Atriums, along with a pair of pads that are going to be fitted. That's going to be the Universe perforated pads. And then you can also choose a second set of pads to come with them. And I'll talk later about my recommended pads if you're buying yourself the Atrium and why I like a couple of different options depending on your music tastes. The other thing you get is a cable. The stock cable is this one here. It's a nice black woven cable. It's really quite nice, and I have no reason to suggest that you would have to buy a better cable for this headphone. But having said that, ZMF also have their OFC cable, which is this one here with the rubber sheathing. And I'll talk in a little while about cables and which ones I prefer and why. But suffice to say, I don't necessarily think I would be choosing the OFC cable for the Atriums. I really like it with the stock cable. or certain aftermarket choices which are available from ZMF and also other manufacturers too. That's what you're going to get in the box with the Atriums. And so the next step is to tell you what's actually going on inside the headphones themselves. Unlike the Verités, which we'll talk about soon, instead of using a beryllium driver like the Verités, the Atriums have returned to using a biocellulose driver, which is what was used in the Auteurs. If you've seen my review of the Auteurs, you'll know that I really enjoyed them, and that was largely because the tonality and the character that comes from a biocellulose driver. That's not to say that biocellulose is the best type of driver on the planet, but it does have certain characteristics that other driver types just can't seem to match. Now, I've recently completed an interview with Zach and Bevan from ZMF. I haven't yet worked out the exact timing, but I'm likely to release that interview tomorrow or the day after. So if you're interested in knowing more about some of the technicalities of why the Atrium's been designed the way it has, why biocellulose and not another beryllium driver, etc., then do stay tuned, make sure you're subscribed, and watch out for the ZMF interview. Continuing on though, talking about the design of the Atrium, the driver in here is essentially an upgraded and revised version of the Auteur driver. That doesn't mean it's basically the same driver, it's all new parts, but it's still a 300 ohm driver, it's also still biocellulose, but each of the individual parts has been optimized and improved with things like stronger magnets, a new version of the voice coil, I believe. And so it's not just a rebranded Auteur, not that I've heard anyone suggest that, but I want to make that clear. It's a whole new headphone, and it's a significant step above the Auteur in the sense that for me, it's competing absolutely with the Verité, whereas the Auteur doesn't quite reach the heights of the Verité. The other thing that's really important to know about the Atrium is what else is going on inside the cups. The reason these have been referred to as the Atrium is because they produce a wonderful sense of space, and also because of the technology that's been built into the headphone itself, which is currently going through a patent application by ZMF Headphones. What's basically going on inside these headphones is that Zach has come up with a system using specially cut and sculpted foam to damp the sound and make sure that there's not too much reflection of the waves coming off the back of the driver, reflecting into the cups and then coming back into the ears of the listener. The reason that's so important is because it reduces distortion, it allows just the purity of the intended musical signal to reach your ears, and that helps with all kinds of things like tonal quality, the spatial cues, some of the real subtleties that you need in the music. Combine that with the slightly slower decay of a biocellulose driver, where it allows the notes to linger just a fraction longer than something fast and speedy like beryllium, and what you've got is a beautiful, organic and natural sounding headphone that throws a wonderful soundstage. And I will talk about that more in a moment, but before I get there, I just want to talk a little tiny bit more about the Atrium technology. And it's worth saying, if you want to know more about the Atrium technology in detail, I'll put a link down below through to the ZMF website where you can go and check out all there is to know about the Atrium headphone, but also the patent pending technology that's built into the Atrium. And this is the first headphone that's got that, so it's your first chance to get your hands on a great advancement in audio. The final thing I do want to mention though about that Atrium damping system is that even though you'll see a really big grille on the back of the Atriums, they actually isolate and therefore I'm assuming leak a bit less than something like the Verite Open. And I'm putting that down to the fact that there is that foam in there. So even though these produce a soundstage size like a more open headphone, they actually isolate more like a semi-open, and therefore I'm assuming they'll leak more like a semi-open as well. I haven't done any tests of the leakage from these. I had to limit the amount that I tried to cover in this review and also wanted to get this review out as quickly as possible, so I've kind of had to pick and choose what I focus on, but I'm fairly confident these will leak less than a Verite Open, but they are still an open or semi-open headphone, and they definitely sound open in the sense of the soundstage they throw. Before we talk about sound quality, it's probably worth talking about day-to-day use of these headphones, what they're like as a day-to-day driver, and what I can tell you is that they're an incredibly comfortable headphone thanks to this wonderful headband mechanism. ZMF have now built these little lumps into the headband, so each of these places where I'm putting my thumb is now a little extension of the padding. And what it means is that, much like some other systems on the market, Sennheiser have done this a while where they cut the groove through the middle of the headband foam, it just seems to disperse the weight better and prevent you getting hot spots anywhere across your head. So these are absolutely an all-day wearer. They've got a bit of weight to them, but they're not incredibly heavy. And they've got this wonderful headband system that I just mentioned. So in between you and the lumps, by the way, there is also a beautiful soft leather band. And then the pads themselves are also very plush. Depending on the pads you choose, some are thicker than others, but they're all very plush and very comfortable. To be clear, the pads I've got on here are not the stock ones, but we'll talk about that in a little while when we get to pad rolling. The final thing I should mention, if you're not familiar with ZMF headphones, is that like all other ZMF headphones in recent times at least, these use a mini XLR socket on the bottom of each cup. And that's great because there's lots of other models around the market using the same connection. So you can buy an upgrade cable, whether it's from ZMF or another brand, and use it with both the ZMFs, but also maybe a pair of Mezzas and multiple other brands as well. So they're a great design, they're very comfortable, I personally think they look beautiful. I'm a bit of a fan of the aged cherry and the aged copper look, but I still think the cherry and black looks wonderful too. As is always the case with any headphone I've tried from ZMF, the fit and finish is just beautiful from these, and in fact these might be one of the best I've tried. There's this lovely smooth finish on the timbre itself, and then it rolls over and dips in slightly where the grill sits, so it all looks extremely high quality. The good news is that also carries through to the sound you're going to hear when you put these on your head. Before I talk about the sound in detail though, I just want to quickly revisit the cables very quickly, and that is to say that as I alluded to before, I actually prefer the stock cable, the basic cable that comes with the Atriums, over the OFC one. Sometimes even when we upgrade a cable in terms of the on-paper specifications or the quality of the wire that's meant to be, it doesn't always result in a better sound. That can come down to things like the geometry of the cable and various other factors. And for me, listening to the Atriums, I personally prefer the stock cable that comes with them rather than the upgrade OFC cable. My understanding is that the wrapped cloth one is the basic stock and the OFC plastic shielded one is actually a step up. That said, I do recommend if you're someone that likes buying upgrade cables and you're in the market for an Atrium and you want to hear their absolute best, I personally would recommend buying yourself a copper litz cable. And I say that because I've used my Aurealis Audio copper litz that I originally bought for my Mezza Empyreans and Elites, and to me that's the best I've heard the Atrium sound. It opens the sound up even more, it gives you plenty of detail, but also a bit better space and focusing of the image. Neither of these two cables are bad, but I think if you're spending $2,500 on a headphone, it's worth getting a better cable if it's going to bring even better sound, and I believe a Litz cable does. Now, I haven't played with any of ZMF's other cables, but checking the website, they do offer other options, including a copper litz, so maybe buy that when you get your Atriums if that's of interest. Otherwise, there's plenty of other manufacturers around making great cables. For those into silver-plated copper, I did try the Mezza Audio silver-plated copper cable that I love with the Mezza Elites, and to me, it wasn't such a great fit with the Atriums. So my recommendation is a copper litz cable, but it could come down to personal taste. So if you've got a few cables to try, or you've got a consistent type of cable you tend to enjoy, then go with that. Before I bog this down on cable talk though, let's talk about the headphones themselves. The Atriums have an amazing ability to be both smooth and detailed at the same time. And I need to be really clear in this video, I'm going to talk about them being smooth a lot, but that never means rich or warm. They're what Zach is calling ZMF neutral, and I tend to agree. What that means is they're not neutral in the sense that they measure rule of flat. It means they're neutral in the sense that they sound close to what a natural live performance would sound like. That means that there is a bit of warmth and punch in the bass when it's needed, but there's also plenty of treble extension and plenty of detail too. When I'm saying that they're smooth, that's more a characteristic of the driver and the fact that it does allow the notes to linger just a fraction longer than what I said before about the Verités, which are super snappy and sharp due to the beryllium driver. As well as that smooth but detailed sound, the other thing that really stood out to me about the Atriums was their sense of soundstage. They produce a wonderful depth in the soundstage and a great spherical shape to it. It's got a very natural shape and natural depth. The soundstage isn't a vast soundstage, so we're not talking about like an HD800 type soundstage, but what we're getting is a great sense of separation of all of the instruments. And so what I'd say is it's not exactly intimate, but it's also not vast of a soundstage, so it's a modest size soundstage, but all of the individual sounds are beautifully placed, very well separated, and it's a headphone that I find as I'm listening to it, I can kind of mentally wander around the soundscape. I can pick out where each instrument is, I can focus on those instruments easily. It's just a joy to listen to in terms of soundstage presentation. Generally speaking, tonal character is excellent across the board. Everything sounds realistic and lifelike. The bass is present and solid, but in no way enhanced. So it's there when you need it, and it backs off when it shouldn't be there. And I'll provide some examples of that a bit later. When a track has some thump and some impact in the bass, the Atrium can absolutely deliver that as well, but thankfully, as I talked about in a recent video, it's not doing that artificially by having some mid-bass hump that produces extra energy in the bass. So it's a headphone that will come and go with the music as the music demands without ever overdoing anything. And I really appreciate that about the Atrium. In a similar fashion, the mid-range I would describe as smooth and rich, but not enhanced in any way. Again, that smoothness and that richness is more coming from the slower decay, and I don't mean that it's a slow headphone, but compared to some really snappy fast headphones, there's just a slightly more laid-back feel, ever so slight, but a slightly more laid-back feel from the Atrium, and that allows the mid-range to have a sense of richness and body to it, without it actually being enhanced or overdone in any way. Nothing from these ever sounds slow or muddy or veiled or thick. It actually just sounds right. It sounds natural and present, with potentially one exception that I'll get to in a minute. Continuing the theme that we've had from the bass and the mid-range of things being just right, the treble from the Atriums is extended, it's detailed, but it's not sparkly treble. It's not overly detailed, overly bright treble, but it definitely extends all the way through. And in that respect, I find the Atriums to be a wonderful, wonderful headphone on almost every genre. And I'm putting that caveat in there because for me, the one time I feel like the Atriums maybe could have done with a bit of extra brightness in the upper registers is when listening to classical music. Now this could come down actually to my tastes leaning towards a slightly brighter, drier sound for orchestral music, but I did feel like they lacked a little bit of texture when listening to classical. On everything else, and I can't stress this enough, on everything else they sound incredible, but when it came to classical, I did want something just a little bit more textural and a little bit snappier from them. The good news is that can be addressed with pads, so stick around for when I talk about pads soon. But before we get there, let me give you my first specific track example to illustrate what I mean about listening to the Atriums with classical music. One of the tracks I used when testing these was Los Vestidos Desgarrados, I hope I'm saying that right. This is from the soundtrack of The Skin I Live In, and it's a track I was listening to as part of my potential test track playlist. If you're not familiar, I'm constantly looking to curate great test tracks to share with channel patrons, so if you're on the lookout for some great test tracks and you're interested in maybe joining up as a patron, it can be a great way to get access to my curated playlists across a whole range of genres and different specific things you might want to listen to when testing out gear. So jump over to Patreon and check that out if you're interested. But carrying on now talking about the Atriums, listening to this orchestral piece from that soundtrack, I felt like with the opening violin solo and then also when the orchestra kicks in later, I just wanted a bit more texture and attack from the sound. This is with the Universe pads, the stock original Universe perforated pads on the Atriums. I just felt like things were a tiny bit too mellow. When the orchestra does come in, it's got a great sense of impact and presence, particularly when the cellos kick in at just after the 1:50 mark. There's a wonderful sense of bass, presence and power without it ever being enhanced in any way. But I did just want that little bit more attack. The sense of space in the room, so the placement of the instruments and the overall sense of space is also excellent. It's just that for me the tonality felt just a little bit too muted, a little bit too smooth. And that, as I said before, could actually be me misremembering what it's like to hear an orchestra live. It has been quite a long time now. And it could therefore just be that my preferences when listening to orchestral recordings is for a little bit more texture and attack. And I say that because everything else I listen to from the Atriums is absolutely sublime. When I shifted over to Once by Pearl Jam after listening to that classical track, all of a sudden the Atriums were perfect again. And so that's why I think maybe it's actually my remembrance of what an orchestra should sound like. Maybe it's from being used to sitting in the orchestra when I used to play violin and viola, as opposed to sitting as an audience member hearing the sound come towards me. So take what I've said about the orchestral playback from the Atriums with a grain of salt, and maybe check out some other reviews to see what others think of them. Because for everything else across the board, whether it's jazz, rock, blues, folk, R&B, hip-hop, everything else without fail that I've tried with the Atriums has been absolutely stellar. And so with all that said, I want to put this into context now by comparing the Atriums with another headphone that you might know well, particularly if you're a fan of ZMFs, and that is the the Verite Open. So this is the previous flagship from ZMF, and I say previous, that's the wrong word. This is the ongoing co-flagship alongside the Atriums. It's priced identically at $2,500 and it offers a different flavour of sound. I've already mentioned that these use a beryllium driver, and that's a faster, snappier sounding driver than what's in the Atrium. And so one of the obvious questions that a lot of patrons have asked me, and no doubt you might be thinking as well, is what's the difference between the two? Which one should I buy, or should I upgrade/sidestep from the Verite into the Atrium? And what I'd say immediately is that they're very different headphones. Very different in the sense that they've got very different characteristics, but they're clearly tuned by Zach. And what I mean by that is they've got what Zach refers to as the ZMF neutral sound, meaning that they're not overly coloured in any way, but they do have a bit of life and presence to their sound. Switching back and forth between the two, there are definitely things that I like more about one over the other. In other words, both of them have their pros and cons. And when I gave my wife a listen to both without telling her anything about what to expect, she actually prefers the Verités, whereas I found myself mostly preferring the Atriums. And I share that example to illustrate that neither of these is better across the board, they're just different. The Verités have a tightness and a speed of bass and a little bit of extra punch in a way, more in terms of speed than bass quantity, but they've got that sense of speed and snappiness and attack that just gives them a slightly different character to the Atriums. When listening to the Verités, things like texture and micro details are brought a little bit more forward into the mix, and I mean both in terms of they're brought closer to you, but also in the sense that they're more available to you. It's not that the Atriums are lacking detail, it's just that the Verités bring it more into focus. To me, I feel like the Atriums do a slightly better job at getting the tonality and the timbre of sounds better, but it's not that the Verités are bad. They do just have ever so slight a sense of that metallicness, and what I mean by that metallicness is it's probably just that speed, that rapidness of each note hitting and decaying away, whereas there's something just a tiny bit more organic about the sound of the Atriums. To help clarify this even further, one of the tracks I listened to when comparing these two was So What by Yuko Mabuchi. Both of these headphones sounded fantastic on this recording, and starting off with the Verités, there was a clear sense of space between all the instruments, with the piano being the main solo instrument really filling centre stage. From there we had the trumpet off to the left and the drums off to the right. The bass hovered somewhere near the piano, but in this particular recording it's not as clearly defined as something like the piano, the trumpet and the drums. Everything from the Verités sounded great, it was very enjoyable and very, very good to listen to. When I jumped over to the Atriums though, I felt like the Atriums brought more of a tactile sense to the piano. What I mean by that was that little bit of extra presence you get from the very slightly slower decay of the notes made the piano feel more present and more lifelike in the sound. I also felt like the drums were a bit more holographic in the soundstage. I could picture them more easily. I could sort of get a sense of their size and scale within the soundstage more. And there was just generally a weight to all of the notes that was just a bit more enjoyable to me than the Verite Open. I noticed that the trumpet felt a bit closer to me from the Atriums than it did from the Verités, and that's one of the biggest distinctions I found between these two headphones. With the Verite Open, it produces a soundstage which is very left and right with not a huge amount of depth. Going to the Atriums, it brings things a little bit closer in, although still a good size, but it pushes more depth into the soundstage. And that to me is part of why I think I lean towards the Atriums. It's a combination of that better depth and that more spherical shape to the soundstage, combined with that slightly better note weight, according at least to my personal preferences. There will be those that absolutely prefer the Verité's snappier, cleaner, sharper sound, whereas I do like that little bit of extra weight and that slight bit of presence that the Atrium brings to the mix. I should make it really clear that I did all of my testing with the stock Universe perforated pads that come with both of these. And so of course you can tweak both headphones with some pad rolling if you want to, but I'm going to save all that for a totally different video. So if you want to hear my deep dive into pad rolling on the Atrium, the Verite Open and the Verite Closed, make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for that one. One final thing I want to mention about the Verite Open versus Atrium comparison was that all of my listening up until now had been focused, or my critical listening at least, had been focused using the Hugo TT2 and the M Scaler. And so I was curious to see what happened if I added a tube amp to the mix. Taking both headphones over to my bottlehead main line, which gives me a low impedance and a high impedance output option, moving it over to that, what I heard was that, to me, the Verite Open actually benefits more from the tube than something like the Atrium does. And so keep that in mind. Because there's already a slightly better note weight coming from the atriums, I felt like whilst they sounded great with tubes, they don't need the tubes, or they don't, maybe need's the wrong word, but they don't actually benefit as much, in my opinion, from the tube amps as something like the Verités do. By using a tube amp with the Verités, you can actually slow down that music slightly and bring a slightly greater sense of presence and weight to the notes. Whereas I feel like the atriums don't really need that. So for me, I'll be using the atriums with a solid state amp, and I'll be using the Verite Opens with the mainline or my Elekit 8200R. That's not to say they're not great across all amplifiers, and as always in my reviews, I try them across a whole bunch of different amps as part of my testing, but I'll only go into depth if I think there's a specific synergy or a specific issue that you should be aware of. And so for me, I do think the atriums are going to be great across the board, but I would lean towards using them with a more neutral setup and a faster setup, whereas with the Verite Opens, I like their sound with a high output impedance and particularly coming from a tube amp. So keep that in mind if it's going to influence your decision. But to close off the comparison between the Atrium and the Verités, and just to give you my final thoughts on the Atrium before we get into some pad rolling, I think both of these are fantastic headphones. It's often coming down for me to a track-by-track decision as to which I like more. During all my testing, I'd flip back and forth between a whole lot of different tracks, and sometimes the Atrium would come out on top, and sometimes the Verité would. So it's really going to come down to a combination of your personal preferences, which one you like the most. If you like a bit of extra presence and body in the sound while still staying mostly neutral and definitely what I would call natural, then the Atrium's the better choice. But if you like your music snappy and sharp and super detailed, then I think the Verité is probably still the better headphone. What's nice about this is that if you like the general ZMF sound and you want two different presentations that don't stray too far apart but are different, then you could absolutely own both. And then of course there's the question of maybe having something like the Atrium as the open headphone and the Verité closed as the closed back headphone. When I do my Verité open and closed review, I'll probably revisit the Atrium and talk about how it compares to the closed Verité just to round out that picture. But for now, I don't want to extend this review too much longer, so let's summarise all that by saying that the Atrium are amazing. I'm absolutely going to be getting a pair for myself because I love them. And at this stage, I'm going to be keeping my Verités as well. We'll see if the Verités eventually move on, because I do probably lean slightly towards the Atrium overall due to its soundstage presentation, but both are still wonderful, and I totally get why ZMF are keeping both in their flagship category. With all that said though, let me give you a quick run through of some pad rolling on the Atrium. If you're not familiar with the concept of pad rolling, every different pad you use has different sonic characteristics. It's basically like changing the room that you put your speakers in, or the specific placement of those speakers in your room. You've got suede pads like the BE2 suedes here. These are going to absorb a little bit of the sound rather than reflecting it all. You've then got perforated and solid pads, and there's even a pair of hybrids which are what's on there now. For all of this testing, I've stuck entirely to perforated pads because the solid pads with a headphone like the Atrium just push all of the bass way too far. So I'm going to talk you through 4 different perforated pad options using the same track across all of them and help you decide which ones you might like the most. The track that I landed on for this testing was So Lonely from the My Songs album by Sting, using the Universe pads, which are the stock pads with the Atrium, so that's the leather Universe perforated pads. With those pads on this track, the Atrium sound fantastic and they really rock. This is a headphone that can absolutely rock when needed, but can also be more delicate and subtle when needed, and that's part of what I love about them. Given that the Universe are the stock pads, I'm not going to say any more about them because I've already covered that off with everything I've said so far in this review. So knowing that that's the baseline, I then moved to the Auteur perforated pads. Again, that's a leather pad with perforations. And what I heard from those was that all of a sudden the kick bass and the bass guitar have a bit more presence in the mix. So there's a little bit more punch, maybe a tiny bit more bass quantity as well, but it's still relatively similar in overall tonality. What also happens though with the Auteur perforated pads is that it brings the soundstage in a bit closer. Not much else has changed though, so it's kind of like you've taken the band and everything else about it, so the exact settings of their amplifiers and their PA and all of that sort of stuff. It's like they've taken that from one venue and put it in a slightly smaller room. It's like going from a large pub to a small pub with the band playing in both. Everything else sounds much the same, it just closes in the sound a little bit. And I don't mean that in a bad way, there's still good separation of sounds and everything like that, but it does reduce the soundstage size. From the Auteur perforated, I then moved over to the BE2 leather perforated pads. And these have a similar soundstage size to what I just described from the Hauteuvres, so it's smaller than the Universe. But what these now do is actually bring the mid-range forward, and particularly the upper mid-range forward. Things like the guitars and the cymbals have a bit more bite and attack with the BE2. This is the leather BE2. I'm going to talk about the suede in a second. So with the perforated leather BE2 pads, there's a nice sense of attack from the guitars. There's a good sense of energy in the mix. As I said, the soundstage is a little bit smaller than from the Universe, but you've still got a good sense of separation of those sounds, just in a smaller overall space. Because there was that bit more attack in the mid-range, I quickly jumped back over to the classical tracks I'd used for testing, and I do feel like the BE2 pads might be a slightly better choice for classical listeners. But I think there's an even better choice, so let's hold that thought. The next pad I used was the Auto Hybrid pads, and that's currently what's sitting on them because this is one of my absolute favourite options on the Atrium. The Auto Hybrid, like the Auto Leather pads, again all perforated, these bring a little bit more punch in the bass again without overdoing anything or boosting anything too far. And whilst the soundstage is still just a tiny bit smaller than with the Universe pads, it's probably somewhere between the Auto Leather perforated and the Universe Leather perforated. It sits somewhere in between the two. Whilst it is just a tiny bit smaller, there's just something intangible and wonderful about the sound. My thinking is that somehow the hybrid pads are just taming the upper treble ever so slightly. Maybe taking a little bit of the energy out, maybe it's just a little bit of the attack or the reflections out of that sound, and it brings the mid-range weight and presence up just ever so slightly. We're talking about a 1 or 2% shift here, but for me, it makes the Atriums absolutely addictive. I love them with the Auto Hybrids, and it's definitely the pad alongside the Universe Leather Perforated that I would recommend for people that listen to music like me. What I mean is rock, blues, pop, a bit of jazz, any of those sorts of genres where you want a good punchy dynamic sound, but you also want a nice sense of space and not an overbalance towards the treble and texture and detail for some of those recordings that maybe aren't quite so well made. I'm not saying the Auto Hybrid pads make these overly thick and warm, it just pulls back ever so slightly on what the Universe pads deliver in terms of energy and attack. But again, it's a 1 or 2% shift. It's just enough to shift our focus to the beautiful qualities of the mid-range from the Atrium's driver. So it's not a total tonality change, just a shift in focus. And that leads me to the final pad that I tried on these, and that was the BE2 perforated suede pad. These are also in the running for my favourite pad on the Atriums. It's a slightly leaner sound. I feel like the bass is slightly reduced or just balanced differently when using the suede pads, the BE2 ones that is. But at the same time, the treble is also a bit smoother. So what the suede tends to do is reduce the number of reflections, which can actually take a little bit of the attack out of the sound. But at the same time, it's bringing forwards those upper mid-range again to make the sound just a little bit drier and a little bit leaner sounding. Much like a couple of the other pads I've talked about, the soundstage does get reduced. That's partly because the BE2 pads bring the driver closer to your ear, and that's generally going to reduce soundstage size. So it's probably not a pad for lovers of huge soundstages, but where it is great is it brings that upper mid-range clarity and texture that I was wanting for classical music. And so for me, the BE2 perforated suede pads would be the third option I'd absolutely recommend, particularly if you're looking for a classical listening headphone. If you're into classical and orchestral music, the Atriums can be an absolute winner, either with the Universe pads, which are fantastic if you want it slightly more laid back than maybe what my preference is, or you get yourself a pair of BE2 suedes and you swap out the pads when you want that dedicated classical listening headphone. They're wonderful with classical music with the suede pads. And so before I stretch this video out to be 2 or 3 hours long, I'm going to wrap things up there with the reminder that I'm going to have more ZMF content coming soon with the Verite Open and Closed, which will also revisit the Atrium. And I've got also a full pad rolling video coming up. So if you want to see more measurements of pads and hear my thoughts on those pads across multiple different ZMF headphones, make sure you're subscribed and make sure you ring the notification bell. For now though, I hope you found this review useful. If you're considering a purchase of a ZMF headphone, I hope this has helped you work out whether the Verite Open or the Atrium is the right one for you. Or maybe it's going to be both. Maybe you're adding an Atrium to complement the Verite. One thing that is probably worth mentioning with that in mind is that even though they're not vastly different in their stock form, with a quick pad roll, you can easily separate them more and make one into maybe a classical listening headphone and the other into more of a pop, rock and blues headphone. So do keep that in mind if you're considering both. As I said though, I hope you found this review useful. If you have, I'd love it if you hit the like button, put a comment down below, let me know anything else you want to know about the Atriums, the Verite Open or closed, and I'll either answer it down below or I'll try to cover it off in my upcoming Verite video. For now though, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.